former special assistant to the US president for Russia, Ukraine, and Eurasia, and a former US ambassador to Kazakhstan and Georgia, and joins us on the line now. Good evening to you, William.
Good evening, Carol.
Really good to have you with us. What do you make of this warning that has apparently gone out to NATO countries that President Putin may be moving equipment as the start of a process of perhaps test firing some form of nuclear weapon near to Russia's border with Ukraine?
It's still too early to tell whether something like this is going to take place. But because there's been so much loose talk in Moscow about nuclear weapons, use of nuclear weapons, not only by President Putin, but by propagandists recently, that it's only prudent for NATO to encourage its member states to keep a close watch out for what may be taking place. Given the opposition, though, that we're seeing in Moscow in the last few days and weeks, actually, to the mobilization and in the deranged speech that President Putin gave last Friday, there may be some internal disruptions taking place in Moscow that may also be a factor in this.
You mean that President Putin might potentially carry out some sort of nuclear test in order to distract from the growing opposition that he's facing in his own country to that effort to mobilize 300,000 more troops for the war in Ukraine?
That theoretically might be a possibility, but I think a greater issue would be whether there are going to be challenges now to Putin's activities, his threats, and whether he's going too far, because we have a combination of military setbacks in Ukraine, both in Kherson now and around Donetsk and Luhansk, further to the north, and popular opposition to the conscription order, the mobilization order that Putin has ordered. So a combination of those seem to be unsettling the political scene a little bit. And so I wouldn't be surprised to see whether there are more uncertainties now about Putin's hold on power than there were earlier.
Do you really think that the protests we've seen, and indeed the criticism from some who are seen as on the military, hardline military right wing within Russia, do you think that could actually lead to some sort of challenge against President Putin?
It's too early to tell. There's too much uncertainty. We have seen, though, in the past, in Russia's past, so after the loss in the Crimean War in the 1850s, after the loss of the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 and 1905, after retreats in World War I, each time Russia underwent some kind of political disruption. We could be seeing something like that again when the Soviets withdrew from Afghanistan, that losing war. That was one of the factors that caused the Soviet Union to collapse in many people's assessment. So right now, this is not a good time for those who are in power to be able to convince people that they are the only people who should retain power.
So to return to the nuclear threats that President Putin has been issuing, I mean, we have had senior figures in the United States saying, well, look, President Putin may not be bluffing about this, that he could actually use a nuclear weapon. Do you think that that is a possibility?
It definitely is a possibility. There's no question about that. But we know so little about what President Putin is thinking and those around him. All of his cohorts are pretty much ex-KGB, ex-Secret Service in the Soviet Union. And so they keep to themselves a great deal, and we really don't know. So, for example, in February, it wasn't clear, even days before the invasion began, whether the invasion would take place or not. So we should not overestimate how much we on the outside know about internal Kremlin decision-making.
What is clear is that not only is President Putin facing more dissent from within his own country, but his forces are suffering further setbacks in their invasion. Ukrainian forces are reported to have liberated another key village in the southern region of Kherson. They've also been trying to push back the Russian troops in other areas that have been controlled by the Russians. It does seem as though, I mean, despite the superior numbers that President Putin can claim, the Ukrainians are succeeding in pushing the forces back in some areas.
Yes, the Ukrainians seem to be having a stronger army now than the Russians, in great part because they are better equipped. You know, there are reports that these new soldiers being conscripted are being told to bring their own uniforms or sleeping bags, that they don't have tourniquets that they can provide these soldiers, so they should provide something on their own. And then there are also reports that people, the conscription soldiers, are not being fed properly. So this suggests a circumstance for quite low morale among these people. So I think we're seeing a situation in which what was perceived before the war to be a definite Soviet superiority, that no longer is the case.
Yeah, Ukraine's Deputy Interior Minister Yevhen Enin said 50 towns and villages had been recaptured and some 3,500 citizens freed in the Kherson region. Though it's not quite clear over which period he is referring. But I don't know if you were hearing my interview with Alexei Goncharenko a few minutes ago. He was saying that if indeed President Putin does attempt even a nuclear test, as opposed to some form of actual nuclear strike, that should prompt NATO into a very strong response, perhaps even sending forces to attack the Russians on Ukrainian soil. Do you think that is something that could happen?
I really can't speculate on what NATO might do in response to a nuclear test or even a nuclear strike on Ukrainian soil. But I would say that NATO and NATO's allies do have capacity with conventional forces to deliver really striking blows against Russian forces if Russia were to turn to a nuclear option. For example, as we saw when the Ukrainians destroyed the Russian flagship in the Black Sea, the Moskva, they did that with two Ukrainian conventional non-nuclear Neptune missiles. Well, Russian warships all around the world are vulnerable to attacks by non-nuclear missiles. So the West would have a considerable range of possibilities that are non-nuclear to deliver what would be quite devastating blows if Russia were to go the nuclear route.
But of course, until now, NATO has been very clear that it will not get drawn directly into conflict with Russian forces.
Yes, that's quite true. But a Russian use of a nuclear weapon or conduct of a nuclear test, that could change circumstances quite considerably, and NATO might feel the need of a stronger response in order to deter further Russian use of nuclear weapons. Now, another important issue for nuclear is what would Russia accomplish with a nuclear weapon? It's pretty clear that it won't scare everybody into stopping resistance to Russia's aggression, although the Kremlin may think it would do that. But the Russian military is not prepared from a military standpoint probably to take advantage of use of a nuclear weapon in terms of sweeping across the battlefield and securing targets that it could not secure before. So there are real military doubts as to the value of a nuclear weapon.
And just finally, I mean, as you say, it's very difficult to read President Putin's mind. But presumably the strategic thinking behind this and the way that Western military analysts are looking at this is to say that the more difficulties Putin is facing at home, the more his troops are being pushed back on the ground in Ukraine, the more likely it could be that he might attempt to carry out some of the threats that he has made.
I would not say that. So in some circumstances, when the Russians have had setbacks, rather than lash out, they have retreated. So, for example, the first major setback in the war was when Russian forces had to retreat from their effort to seize the capital, Kiev, at the outset. And they retreated. They did not lash back in some stronger way. So people should be careful about predicting how Russia may react to a certain tactical development on the battlefield. What the Russians call a correlation of forces, an amalgam of power and influence, is moving against Russia, and it's moving against the Kremlin inside Russia. So it may be that Russia will have to accommodate itself to a decline in correlation of forces rather than trying to take some step that would leap ahead of everything, such as nuclear use. It's just too difficult to predict how Russia will react to any particular activity.